There's a lot of buildings at Pitt, by my count 73, and a lot of them have interesting names. From MERVIS to ERVIS, FALK to SALK to Holland Hawk, there's 73 unique stories to tell baked into our beloved beige buildings. But before we can get into the genealogy and etymology and just a little bit of pseudo-psychology, let's lay down some ground rules. Rule 1, no UPMC buildings. If it has the University of Pittsburgh sign in front, it's good. If it has the UPMC sign in front, no good. Just like that voiceover. Rule 2, no buildings outside of Pitt's main campus. Mostly. There's a couple in a gray area that I included anyway, but we'll talk about them later. But if it's not on the Oakland campus, I don't care about it. I know you all love the Motor Pool Repairs building at 530 Melwood Avenue and the Allen L. Cook Spring Creek Preserve in Wyoming, but right now, I don't. And rule 3, a lot of buildings are just named for the streets they're on, and so to avoid constant repetition, we'll go into the names of the buildings and not constantly repeat, the street is also called, whatever, you get the idea. Well, we've got 73 buildings to get through, so let's get right into it. I've broken them down into a few categories, and we'll start with the first category that I like to call uncreative. These buildings are generally exactly what they say on the tin. They've got names, but they're not people names, and we begin, in no particular order, with
Fraternity Housing Complex.
It's not that complex.
Panther Hall.
Stay warm, Panthers.
Alumni Hall.
Stay warm, alumni.
Pitt Sports Dome.
You could pop this thing with a very sharp carrot.
Biomedical Science Tower 3.
What about the other two? Stay tuned and maybe you'll find out.
Learning Research and Development Center.
May it rest in peace. I'm gonna miss that wacky slope.
Old Engineering Hall.
It's the old Engineering Hall. Back when it was just called Engineering Hall, which is somehow even less creative, it served as the home of the School of Engineering from 1955 to 1971, when it moved across the street to a building we'll get to later.
Space Research Coordination Center.
Pitt won a NASA grant in 1962 to build this place, but now it's the home of the Department of Geology and Environmental Science, but we still keep the name because space is cool, I guess.
Nuclear Physics Laboratory / Van de Graaff Building.
They can't seem to decide on the name of this place, but one way or another, it was built to house the world's first 3-stage Van de Graaff accelerator. The naming had nothing to do with the inventor, Mr. Robert J. Van de Graaff himself, though.
University Club.
It's a big club, and you actually are allowed in it.
Music Building.
This place was actually the original home of Pittsburgh's WQED and the original production site of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's such a good feeling to know this building wasn't always so boring. It's such a happy feeling to know this is going on for too long, and when you wake up, ready to stop.
Information Sciences Building.
No further information.
Cathedral of Learning.
Learn!
Log Cabin.
This thing was originally built in the 19th century. Now they use it to store salt.
Bellefield Hall.
Bellefield Tower, Bellefield Avenue, Bellefield Presbyterian Church, Bellefield Hall. They're all named this because they sit on the former site of former Pittsburgh Gazette editor Neville B. Craig's Bellefield Farm.
Center for Biotechnology and Bioengineering.
This is where the 40A goes. I never knew that.
And the Residence in University Medical Center.
Which will probably be changing names because Pitt just bought it. Next up, just to get them out of the way, it's the category that I like to call the pieces of garbage category. All those unsavory characters that somehow still have their names on our buildings.
Public Health Building.
This isn't in the prior category because it actually used to be named Perrin Hall. Its namesake, former Surgeon General and Pitt Public Health Dean Thomas Perrin, was the mastermind behind two infamous syphilis experiments in the 1940s. In the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, researchers led by Perrin withheld treatment for black men who were infected with syphilis long after a cure had been discovered. And in the Guatemala syphilis experiment, his team purposefully infected soldiers, sex workers, prisoners, and mental patients in Guatemala without their consent, resulting in at least 83 deaths. So while it may be a boring name, it's a hell of a lot better than the old one.
Bouquet Gardens.
Not a real flowery one here. Colonel Henry Bouquet captured and defended Fort Pitt from the Native Americans in the French and Indian War, and led the group that attempted biological warfare by giving blankets from a smallpox hospital to the natives to infect them.
FORBES-CRAIG Apartments.
We'll talk about Forbes later, but Isaac Craig was a businessman in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and was the 4th Chief Burgess, or the equivalent of the mayor, of Pittsburgh. But he also bought, owned, and sold at least 8 slaves in his adult life.
O'Hara Garage.
Gone but never forgotten.
O'Hara Student Center.
But the O'Hara of both is gone and not forgotten. James O'Hara was Chief Burgess right after Craig, and the owner of a vast amount of land in Pittsburgh. I probably don't even have to tell you that that means he owned double digits of slaves.
And the Frick Fine Arts Building.
Helen Clay Frick gifted this building to the university, but it's named after her father, Henry Clay Frick. Frick was a coke and steel magnate in the era of robber barons who was directly involved in two deadly historical events. He led an initiative to lower a dam's height to build a road to a luxury resort he helped found, which led to the Johnstown flood that killed over 2,200 people. And when unionized workers went on strike at a Carnegie steel factory under Frick's watch, Frick hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to break it up, and it's unknown who fired first, but the battle between the Pinkertons and the strikers led to 10 to 15 deaths and the crushing of steel unions for quite a while. And now for the buildings that some people spent a pretty penny to get their name or their family's name on.
Fanny EDEL Falk Laboratory School.
Leon Falk Jr. was a Pittsburgh steel magnate who founded this elementary school with his sister. They named it in honor of their mother, Fanny.
Charles L. Cost Sports Center.
Former Pitt football player Charles L. Corky Cost donated $1 million in 1990 to get this place named after him, and
Charles L. Cost Field.
This one came later.
Vartabedian Field.
Pitt alumnus Nish Vartabedian donated an unknown but generous amount of money to build this softball field in 2011.
Joseph C. Trees Hall.
Joe Trees, Pitt's first subsidized athlete in 1891, sent in a whopping $100,000 in 1912 to build the old demolished Trees Gymnasium, and the name stuck.
Peterson Events Center.
$10 million from John and Gertrude Peterson in 2002. John was, until his death in 2015, the retired CEO of the Erie Insurance Group.
Eberly Hall.
The whole EBERLY family, Robert, Carolyn, Robert III, got this one in return for their longtime support of the university.
Chevron Science Center.
This one's not a person, it's a corporation, but Chevron gave the university a $100 million oil research center, and all they got in return was this lousy building.
BARCO Law Building.
In 1986, George BARCO and his daughter Yolanda used their cable TV fortunes to fund the BARCO Law Library in this building. 17 years later, and $10 more million later, the whole shebang was named after him.
BENEDUM Hall.
Before he died, Michael Late BENEDUM, an oil baron, put his family fortune into a foundation named for his son, Claude Worthington BENEDUM, who died young in the Spanish flu pandemic. That foundation funded this building, but it's named after Michael.
THAW Hall.
Benjamin THAW Sr., part of the third generation of the super-rich THAW banking family, had given a substantial amount toward the erection of this building.
Gardner Steel Conference Center.
Gardner Steel isn't a steel company. Gardner Steel was a guy. He was a former Pitt athlete and an oil investor who left his life savings to the university to construct a building after he died.
HEINZ Memorial Chapel.
What do you think?
HILLMAN Library.
After the demolition of Forbes Field, coal magnate J. Hartwell Hillman Jr. donated the land to the university to build this library.
And MERVIS Hall.
Also on the former Forbes Field site, Lou and Myra G. MERVIS were the benefactors behind Pitt's shiniest building. Now we move on to the people who have buildings named after them, but didn't specifically pay millions or billions to do it, and weren't complete pieces of historical garbage.
Thomas Detry Hall.
This one's complicated, which is why we're starting with it. This building has both UPMC and Pitt signs outside of it, but it's actually owned by the Pennsylvania government and leased to Pitt for $1 a year. Pitt, in turn, subleases the building to UPMC, but either way, it was dedicated in 2000 to Thomas Detry, arguably the most important person in the history of Pitt's medical sciences program. His University Times obituary is as long as the entire script of this video.
David Lawrence Hall.
Hey, it's Larry, as I call him. He was the first and only mayor of Pittsburgh to be elected governor of Pennsylvania in 1959.
K. Leroy Irvis Hall.
Irvis represented Allegheny County in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives for 30 years and was the first black Speaker of the House of any state legislature.
DARRAGH Street Apartments.
John DARRAGH was the second mayor of Pittsburgh, and unlike those guys before, I can't find any evidence that he owned any slaves. Which isn't an accomplishment, that's kind of the bare minimum, but hey.
Sutherland Hall.
Jock Sutherland was the Pitt football coach from 1924 to 1938 and won them 5 national championships.
SALK Hall and Pavilion.
Used to be a hospital, but is now named after Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine while working at Pitt.
Thomas E. STARZL Biomedical Science Tower.
There's the other towers. STARZL was a transplantation pioneer and the first person to perform a human liver transplant.
Alan MAGEE SCAIFE Hall.
SCAIFE was the president of Pitt's Board of Trustees in the 1950s. His eugenicist and anti-immigrant hate group funding daughter Cordelia brought the building's name under scrutiny, but Alan MAGEE SCAIFE himself was not in fact as terrible as his garbage children.
Crabtree Hall.
James A. Crabtree was the public health dean right after Perrin, but unlike his predecessor, he didn't commit any crimes against humanity. Again, not really an accomplishment, but hey.
Allen Hall.
Dr. Alexander Allen, a physics professor who developed Pitt's first radioactive isotope-producing cyclotron.
Amos Hall.
Teresa Amos was the Dean of Women at Pitt from 1919 to 1941. Dean of Women.
Stephen Foster Memorial.
Foster was one of the most influential songwriters of the 19th century, but he leaves behind a complicated legacy of minstrel show stereotypes and racist songs. But some historians and abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass himself, argue that the songs humanized their subjects and awakened anti-slavery sympathies in their listeners, which softens his legacy for most. And I'm not going to argue with Frederick Douglass.
Lothrop Hall.
Possibly the most infamous dorm of all, it's named for Sylvanus Lothrop, who built some of the first locks and bridges on the Monongahela River in the early 1800s.
Thackeray Hall.
William Makepeace Thackeray, 19th century British novelist of Vanity Fair fame.
Ruskin Hall.
John Ruskin, 19th century British writer and philosopher. Real estate developer Franklin Nicola named these streets these last two buildings are on after British authors to make his Shenley Farms neighborhood seem more high-end and classy.
Clapp Hall.
George Hubbard, aluminum magnate and longtime member of Pitt's Board of Trustees, got this building named after him after he died.
Murdoch Building.
Property owner Merland Associates LP named this place after the man who started their family real estate company 7 generations ago, John Murdoch.
William Pitt Union.
William Pitt the Elder, the first Earl of Chatham, was the British Secretary of State when the British seized the French Fort Duquesne. The settlement was renamed Pittsburgh in his honor, and then we named this building after him a little over 200 years later.
3343 Forbes Avenue.
And
Forbes Hall.
named for John Forbes, the guy who led that aforementioned expedition to seize Fort Duquesne from the French.
Langley Hall.
Samuel P. Langley, a professor of astronomy at Pitt and an aviation pioneer. One of his planes hangs in Posvar Hall, which comes up soon.
Markane Ordenberg Hall.
It's Pitt's newest dorm, named after the Chancellor before our current Chancellor.
Jerome Cochran Public Safety Building.
Jerry Cochran was Nordenberg's right-hand man as the university's executive vice-chancellor from 1995 to 2014.
Wesley W. Porsvar Hall.
The 15th chancellor of the university, 2 before Nordenberg.
Crawford Hall.
Pitt's only chancellor to serve while not alive. Stanton C. Crawford was appointed the 13th chancellor 4 months after he died, and then he got this building named after him while still not alive.
Litchfield Towers.
Edward H. Litchfield, the chancellor before Crawford. Side note, in between these two, there was an acting chancellor named Charles B. Nutting. Let's just marinate on that one for a little bit.
Fitzgerald Fieldhouse.
Rufus Fitzgerald, the chancellor before Litchfield.
McCormick Hall.
Samuel McCormick, the chancellor before John Gabbert Bowman, who was before Fitzgerald.
Holland Hall.
William Jacob Holland, the chancellor before McCormick.
Bruce Hall.
Robert Bruce, the first chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh.
And Brackenridge Hall.
And we've finally gone all the way back. Hugh Henry Brackenridge founded the Pittsburgh Academy in 1787, the initial stage of our favorite university's existence. And finally, a couple that we simply don't know.
Eureka Building.
No clue. Archimedes?
Victoria Building.
It's on Victoria Street, but who's Victoria? Probably the Queen, but who knows?
Senate Square.
It's on Senate Street, but I dug and dug and dug and dug, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out who Senate was, or is.
And the Ambrose Urbanic Field.
TribLive says funding for the Ambrose Urbanic Field came from an anonymous donor, so I guess we'll never know who Ambrose is. Well, that's it. There's a lot more information that I could have included, but this video would have been even longer than it already is. So if you're interested, there's a remarkable amount of information in the Pitt University archives to trawl through. But for now, that's all I've got. Stephen Foster, play us out.
And when you wake up, ready to say,
I think I'll make a snappy new day. I can't snap. It's such a good feeling. A very good feeling. The feeling you know that this is finally over.